we did last time before we jump right in? Okay, I'm not seeing anything. So we were talking about the 1866 Constitution last time. So let's get down there, and that was our last one. And so we talked a little bit about this Constitution. So what we got going on here, of course, is that this is the Constitution right after the Civil War, right? This is the Constitution that brought us back into the United States. And so it was actually the wording, right? The development of this Constitution was controlled by people that were sympathetic to the Union, right? To the U.S. government. And so a lot of the things that the way this was constructed was to make sure that we as states coming out of the Confederacy came back into the U.S. with the right kind of emphasis on the right kind of things. Mainly this last point here, right? The abolition of slavery. But also a look at the, under number one here, right? The aligning with the nation, that we had the right kind of policies and practices in place to let people who we have legally excluded from the process get involved in the process. At the same time, right, we see the Civil War amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th amendments to the U.S. Constitution coming in to reinforce the idea of citizens and their voting rights and extending to all people, all males. Let me rephrase that. It's still the 1800s. And so that's the point of this Constitution, right? The 1866 one is to bring us back into that. The period that occurred for about a decade after this Constitution, we refer to as Reconstruction. And Reconstruction is that period from the that right brings the South from 1865, right, brings the South into the nation as a whole again. But the federal government is trying to ensure that the southern states are doing things that meet the requirements of treating people the same, making sure that universal male suffrage actually is universal. And so we had, in all of the states in the South, a lot of dragging of feet, a lot of folks that have been pushed out of government that were Democrats. The party of Lincoln was the party of the Republicans, and so we had Republicans coming down into the southern states, taking offices in government, trying to ensure that those governments followed where the Union as a whole was going, and to try to ensure that the rights of all males, right, were being looked after. They could vote, they could participate, they could run for office, which of course a majority of right white males at the time didn't agree with in the South, right? We'd lost the war, we'd fought on this issue of slavery and having absolute control over our economic systems that were based on slavery, right? So pulling this pillar out and saying, right, all males, regardless of race, get the same ability to participate is a big deal. Yes, this is before the parties flipped, right? So the Democrats, especially the Southern Democrats, were the most excuse me, most of the people in government in the South prior to and through the Civil War. The Republican Party had put up Lincoln, right, and Lincoln got elected as president. The Republican Party was right trying to establish itself at the national level, and the Civil War, right, secession happened. And so you've got the party of Lincoln running the Union, the Republicans and the Democrats in the South. And so, right, when Reconstruction happens, when the federal government, right, comes down into the South to ensure the governments are working right, at the state level, Republicans came down and took those positions, right? They were put into power. And they stayed in power for about a decade, right? From the 1860s to middle of 1870s, 1873, basically, 1872. Reconstruction as a federal policy ended right after a few years, but and some of those folks went back to the north. But 1866, we had this Constitution put in place. We didn't actually get around to approving it to 1869. Right, there's a lot of wrangling going on politically, but this was the Constitution that's supposed to make all this happen. When Reconstruction officially ended, and when the Republicans went back to the north, and left the southern states, the idea was, of course, that the Republican Party was here and was going to stay here and was going to be a competitive party, and the Democrat Party be allowed to be competitive, and those two parties would compete in the political system. And that's not really what happened, right? In the South, the Democrats, came back into power, took control of the state governments, and immediately started winding the clock back and trying to make the Democratic perspective, and that being a racist perspective at the time, the way we actually did things. Now, federal law said, all males get to vote. Federal law said all males can run for office. Federal law said a lot of things, but where the rubber met the road down in the states were making those calls. And so what we see immediately as the states get control over their own governments again, the feds move out, is that things are going to change, and we're going to see that change. So the ruling part of the states did not like all of this, of course, from the federal government, and we're going to do what they wanted to do. And so we start seeing change right away. It's not quite that simple, but that's not incorrect, right? And we can talk about that because what's going on, of course, is that the Democrats were the party of secession, the Democrats were the party of slavery in the 1860s. And then the Democrats take control again of all these state governments in the 1870s. And then they start implementing the same policies that they had prior to the Civil War, They can't implement slavery, but they can implement other policies that have some of the same economic effect and some of the same denial of rights and privileges to all males in the South. So they did, now. In the South, the Republican Party was just pushed out, starting from the middle of the 1870s forward, and it was not a real political opportunity for those in the South to be able to be a member of the Republican Party and get elected to office, If you're running, because there's this reaction to the Republicans are the federal government. They represent the North. They represent everything that was contrary to what the Southern states were fighting for. And so from the 1870s until basically 1960s and 1970s, you didn't get elected to office very much if you were a Republican in the Southern states, in the secessionist states. The Democrats were the only functional party for about a century. During the Civil Rights era in the 1960s, 62, 63 through 65, the Democratic Party, in the North had become the party of the people and the party of civil rights. The Republican Party was the party of conservatism and slow change. That's the flip. But in the South, you still just had the Democrats. And so if you were going to run for office in the South, you ran as a Democrat. Now, you might be a conservative Democrat and have Republican views, but you got elected as a Democrat. Or you might have, right, liberal Democratic views and got elected as a Democrat. But in the South, everybody was a Democrat. And so we talked about Southern Democrats and Democrats, and or Dixiecrats and Democrats in the South. And they were all a member of the same party, but they represented the whole political spectrum. With the civil rights stuff churning up in the 1960s, the Republican Party became politically viable in the South again. And so Dixiecrats, or Southern Democrats that still held to conservative traditional values and weren't pushing as hard on the civil rights era, it became functionally possible for them to be Republicans and align with all the other Republicans in the nation and get elected in the South. And so that's where you really see the split. And then you see, because of that, you see the rise of the Republican Party in the South, starting in the late 60s, early 70s. And it solidifies in the 80s when we see the Southern states support Ronald Reagan and he wins presidency. So the Republicans today are much closer. I don't want to say they're the same, but they are closer to the state-focused ideals and conservative ideas of Democrats in the 1950s, 1960s, and have developed from there, right? And then the Democrats today are logically the extension of the Republican Party from the Civil War, right? That was focused on civil rights. And these are very broad strokes when I say this, because I don't want to give the impression that the Republican Party doesn't have a focus on civil rights. They do. It's different than what the Democratic Party has and what they think needs to be worked on, right? So in that sense, you need to try to be somewhat accurate. But yeah, that flip happened, right, as you talk about, Robert. And so that's how we see the organization of the parties today. So in the 1860s to 70s, through Reconstruction, and then after Reconstruction ends, what we see is this mainly conservative focus in the South to getting things back the way they were before, right? We talked about that little conservative ideology of conservatives don't want to change things that they thought worked or they think are good, or right, and they hearken to the past. And so we see this, right, although it was occurring in the South, and we see it in Texas. The party, right, was looking at what was done by the Republicans that had come down through Reconstruction, and they said, look, the federal government forced that 1866 Constitution on us. They forced those changes on us. That Constitution doesn't really reflect who we are in Texas politically, right? And we should be writing a Constitution that fits Texas, not the one the federal government thinks fits Texas. So there was already a big push to come up with a new Constitution. Throw in that a historical experience, right, where the governor of Texas, Governor Davis, under the 1866 Constitution, right, had a lot of power as governor, had a lot of ability to drive political policy, had a lot more ability to implement political policy the way he thought it ought to be implemented, and he used that power. And he used that power to the extent that he was using the state police force as his own police force, right? Almost his personal police force. He didn't like how people reacted in a certain place or not. He would send his police force to enforce the policy that he thought was legal. And this had a lot of people up in arms because, right, this is a government that's supposed to be a government of small government and local government. And here you have the executive of state government reaching down into local politics with his state police. And that wasn't going over well. And so you had this drive to change the Constitution because we felt it had been forced on us during Reconstruction. And now you have this idea that the governor has too much power within the Constitution's in place. Maybe we need to change that. And then two, we had a huge property and tax rates in the state, or at least people had that perception that they were too big. The cost of education was high, right? We were using property taxes to fund that education, and people were having a hard time, wanting to meet that tax burden, and so they wanted to change some things. What you had essentially was two groups of people in Texas that were wanting to change the Constitution. You had libertarians and you had populists. Libertarians, right, are the group of people that have as their kind of guiding idea that small government is best because we want government is evil, and generally speaking. It uses the power of the people as a whole to enforce things on others, and we don't like that kind of policy violence. So we want as little government as we can have to provide protection and opportunity, and then get out of the way. So for a government that was looking like Governor Davis's government and a Reconstruction government, libertarians were having an issue, right? This government's too big, it's too strong, it's doing a lot of things we think are illegitimate. We need to get rid of it. We need to shrink this government. Populists, who we haven't talked about, are those folks that, and Texas had a good number of them at this period in time, people that thought the government had a role to play, a big role to play in society, and that it's a good tool and that people should use government as an effective tool whenever they wanted to and needed to. So they don't have the same perspective that government's evil the way libertarians do. They have quite the opposite, right? I'm from the government, I'm here to help, is kind of their mantra. So government for populist is a good thing because it's going to solve societal problems. It's going to help drive society as a whole one direction. We're going to be in a group and we're going to be happy and we're going to make good decisions and kumbaya, right? So, populism is driven by majoritarian effect, right? Lots of people, a majority of people saying this is what's good for society and let's use government as a tool to deliver this perfect society. Well, the thoughts that they were having was, hey, this government's going the wrong direction under Governor Davis. We need to start looking at maybe how we can change that. Not that they necessarily wanted to shrink government that much, but they wanted to look at it. So here's the two breakdowns, right? Libertarians looking at a new constitution said, look, we're spending all kinds of money on education, and while we want education and it's a good program, we have to be fiscally responsible or we're going to get in trouble. So they wanted a balanced budget. They wanted something that said, whenever we decide to do something with government in Texas, we're going to have the money on hand when we do it. So that's one of the things that they thought would help solve some of our education problems and how we funded it. The other thing that they wanted was the legislature to have control over where budgets got spent, because Governor Davis had a lot of authority about shifting monies around. So they came up with this idea of dedicated funds to say, hey, when the legislature says we're going to spend money on X, if they call it a dedicated fund for X, nobody can change that, right? Once the legislature as a whole says we're going to spend money here, and we put it in a dedicated fund for that, it will be spent there. Now, there are other funds in the Texas budget that are not dedicated that can be moved around, But they thought, on some of these important things like education, right, we're going to dedicate money to it, and that's all we're going to spend. Nobody's going to bring more money in, nor are they going to take money out. And then, of course, they thought government was too big and had too much power, so they wanted to limit the size of government. They wanted to limit the power of government, right? They wanted to shrink it, as all good libertarians do. The populists that agreed with them for different reasons, but they agreed with them that we needed a new constitution to do some things. One, they wanted to make government closer to the common man. Not necessarily they didn't necessarily want to shrink it, although shrinking was fine if it generated power at the local level and not with the governor, not with the state legislature. If we can generate, right, where most policies are implemented, most policies are generated at smaller places, closer to the people, where the people can have a bigger impact, that's good government, right? That's what populists want. Populists want everybody to be involved, right? Now, what this is, the drive for this, right, this populism in Texas, was coming from concerns that were cropping up between agrarian interest and commercial interest, business interest. Texas was, and still is to a good extent, focused on agriculture and ranching. And what's going on in the 1860s and 1850s and 60s and such is the expansion of the railroads throughout the state. And these rural or agrarian interests, right, were starting to use the railroads to get their crops and their cattle, right, to market. The thing is that these railroads were privately owned. And so the railroad robber barons would charge whatever they wanted, right? So essentially you get people used to using your service. It's fast, it's efficient, it's a lot more effective than driving your cattle to market or trying to transport, by wagon load or something like that, your crops. Right, you can load everything on a train and send it off, and it gets there, and you get paid sooner, and they get there in better shape, and everybody's happy, and it's better business. But you got to pay for that. Yes, monopoly. That's exactly where we're moving, right? Is these railroads are generating a monopoly, and these business interests in the rural areas became dependent upon that monopoly, and they could raise the prices as they wanted to. And so we've got a lot of folks that are saying, hey, this monopoly that's going on in the corporate kind of perspective over the business areas is killing us, right? And government's helping it. Government's allowing it to happen. Government should maybe step in and regulate that so that, right, I'm not trying to say they can't make a profit, but they can't gouge us on prices, right? We'd really like the government to do something, this is a populist focus, on helping us, right, be able to get to market and to make a good living and kind of rein in these excesses of the market system. So they're asking for government to be moved closer to the people. They're asking for government to be involved in regulation of commercial interests. And then the other thing that comes out of this is the idea that is a kind of a rebellion against the idea that judges should be an extension of the executive branch. Because what's happening in a lot of places, a lot of states, and in the federal level as well, is that you've got executives, governors, and the president appointing judges. So your Governor Davis, who's using all your power here, and you're appointing people to be judges. So you've got the police power, and you've got your friends that you put into judge positions delivering verdicts on the law. Lets you get a lot of things done that way, right? When you can both have the police power and have the court power because you've appointed all those people and they're dependent upon you for that job, that's a big deal. Populists were responding to that, saying, it's too much power to be vested in one office. That we need to right make judges responsible to the people, not responsible to the governor. And the best way to do that is to elect our judges, right? Let's move away from appointing them to office, and let's let the people choose who they want to be judges in their cities and in their counties, right? We don't need a governor doing that for us. We can make those decisions for ourselves. And so there's a big populist drive for electing judges. And you see a lot of states in this time period make this switch from appointing judges to electing judges. All of these big ideas coming from the populists and all of these ideas coming from the libertarians require changes in our Constitution. So they're pushing it, right? So they're going to, sorry, I don't need to go there yet. They're going to change the Constitution. We're going to move from the 1866 Constitution to the 1876 Constitution. And what we're going to see is that democratizes the appointment of judges by making them elected. It reduces the power of the executive office, the governor, right? It actually breaks it up into a lot of different places. And it puts political power closer to the people so that they can make decisions they want, which are, given the political climate, different than what the Federalists, the Republicans at the national level wanted. We see the growth of dedicated funds. We see the growth we see the institution of a balanced budget in this 1876 Constitution. And so because we've got all these very specific things that we're trying to do in 1876, the Constitution that's put into place changes its very nature. And it moves from an ideal Constitution, which is general and non-specific and allows interpretation, to a statutory Constitution, which is very specific, which is on point, which is saying this is exactly what you can do or can't do in a lot of places. And that's the Constitution we still have today, is that 1876 Constitution at the base level. Now, again, we've amended it many, 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 many times to try to keep the document up to date, so it's still functional and works as a guiding document for government. But we're still responding and working from this 1876 plan for our state government, right? So it's interesting that we see libertarians and populists, people who are on completely opposite ends of the political spectrum, coming together on these issues, right? And generating enough support to institute a new constitution that's statutory in nature and gets the things they want done. Generally, these two groups don't have much that they agree on, but because of the historical circumstances of the time, both economic and political, they did, right? And so we see this happen. Does that make sense? Any questions? All right, so we're talking about changing the Constitution, right? We've talked that that they're voting in a new Constitution, but we also talked about the statutory Constitution has required many, many, many amendments to it. The interesting thing is that you can look to constitutions to tell you how to change them, right? Constitutions include, right, generally a process to change these basic rules and that we have there. So let's look at the two ways that we can change the Constitution in Texas. So these are live today. One, you can change the Constitution in little bits and pieces, right, which we do with amendments, and we've done hundreds and hundreds of times with this current Constitution. Or, as we've talked about previously with the libertarians and the populists, if you can get enough people agreeing at the same time, you can change the whole thing, right? You can just start over. Let's just write a new one and vote it in, right? We can start all the way over. So let's talk about piecemeal for a little bit. And I'm going to jump over real quick. I think we're going to get to Chapter 3 today, so I'm going to start that loading up back here in the background real quick. And then we'll come back to this. Okay, so piecemeal approach. In other words, how do we amend our current Constitution? And the Texas Constitution lays it out pretty clear for us. It says, look, you got to put all this together. You got to get the legislature in on it. You got to get the people in on it, and you can make this happen. There's some good things that come about this, right? Because a piecemeal or amendment process allows us to fine-tune what's going on, right? It lets us to adjust our Constitution just where it needs adjusting. We don't have to all come together at one point and agree on a whole new Constitution. We can just say, okay, 99% of this thing's working for us, but we got a problem here, right? The world's changed such that this doesn't work anymore. Let's just change that, right? And that's what amendments do, right? Amendments are usually very focused, small change in the Constitution that keeps everything else the same. And that's a good thing because it preserves all of the processes that we have in place. It preserves all of the elements of government that we have in place. It just changes the parts that need updating. So the piecemeal process, that's the amendment process for us, and that's a good thing. The bad thing, and there are several bad things, and this number's out of date, we're over 500 now. There are bad things, though, about this slow, incremental, step-by-step process. One, it means your Constitution is a live document, right? Every couple years, right, we can be changing it, and we change only bits and pieces of it. And so we have to have experts around to keep up with what has changed and what hasn't changed, and where we're going, and does this still work, or did this change here mess something else up? Do we need to make another change because of the change we made here, right? And we have a whole team of lawyers, constitutional lawyers that work for the state of Texas, that their job is to make sure that as we change the Constitution, that the fallout from that change is addressed through all the rest of the law. Remember, constitutions are your base law, and they set into context how you pass other law, statutory law. So when we change the Constitution, it's very possible that the constitutional change can have statutory law impacts, right? So right now the Constitution says the legislature can do X. And so the legislature passes a bunch of things like X, and those are statutory laws, and they're out there working. And then we come back and amend the Constitution and say, well, you can only do part of X now. And anything that's over in this area, you can't do anymore. We've changed that. Well, okay, the people vote that through, right? The legislature votes that through. You've changed the Constitution. Now you've got all this statutory law that was written beforehand that you have to update as well. And somebody needs to know all of that, right? That's a lot of keeping up, right? And sometimes we miss that. And sometimes you'll have statutory law out there that no longer lines up with constitutional law, which is not right, right? And means the government can be going two different ways depending upon whether they're paying attention to the statute or the Constitution. And there shouldn't ever be a discrepancy between them. Earlier, I showed you the first introduction to the 1876 Constitution. I showed you this section that talks about you have to recognize a supreme being to be eligible to run for office. That's outdated law. We cannot enforce that. We have not passed an amendment to get that out of there. So we just ignore it, which is not a good way to go about having law in place, right? So this happens quite a bit. And so we have teams of lawyers that's their job, is to keep making sure that as we step by step change the Constitution, that all the effects down the line are addressed as well. And so, right, they'll come back and say, okay, we changed the Constitution here. Now we need to change these statutes. And then the legislature can take care of that on their own, but they need to know about it. So it requires an awful lot of experts that are both historians in the sense of keeping track of what's been going on for a long time, and are constitutional experts that they understand what the law is from the constitutional perspective, and then statutory experts that know the current state law that's been implemented by the legislature. You could even throw in policy experts at the bureaucracy level that make rules based on statutory law, right? So got an immense amount of paperwork out there that can be affected by one constitutional amendment change. Then, of course, this amendment process requires us to take a very long process, and a long process as far as time to get things changed, right? Because it requires the legislature to come up with the idea and propose it and pass it. Then it requires us to put that proposal on a ballot for the public to vote on, right? So that you're going to have the legislature propose something in the spring of an odd number year. You may not get, right, that proposal in front of the populace until November of that odd number year, or maybe March of the next even numbered year. It may take a while, right? So you could have the Constitution in flux, right? Now the old law is still in place, but you know these changes are coming, right? And so if you're wanting to make the statutory changes, right, you anticipate that that's going to pass. You're going to have to wait, right, till the Constitution actually gets voted to be changed. The amendment gets put into place, and then the next legislative session, you come in and change the statutory language behind it. So it's a long process. It's a timing-based thing, and it's a little convoluted in that. And then, as this last bullet is pointing out, this can become a very big deal, right? We're over 500 amendments now to the Constitution. Some of those amendments, later amendments, are changing prior amendments who changed, right? So you can see how this kind of builds up on itself, right? So those are some of the issues that we have by taking this slow piecemeal approach. Now, the other way to change the Constitution is to throw the whole thing out and start over, right? This Constitution has done its job, and we're going to start with a new one. I mean, we're on our 6th Constitution, right? So we've done this a few times. So there's some good things here that come about, right? Getting rid of the old and starting new again. One, everything can be in one place at one time in language that we all understand, right? When you write a new Constitution, it's going to make a lot more sense, right, to everybody today. We've got, and I read you some of that, right, some of the language that you kind of have to really pay attention to for it to make sense, because it's 35, 45, 50 years old, and we don't talk the same way. We don't write the same way that we used to. And so one of the real easy considerations that people agree on about a new Constitution is we can make it more understandable because we can write it in the language that we use today. We can write it so that it can be understood. That's a good thing. The other thing is we can throw out all of the old stuff with the new Constitution. We can look at those amendments that are in place, right? And we can say, okay, let's write this right from where we are today and just have the new, what's new, right, in here. Here's our new Constitution. We're going to do these things, and we're doing this thing. We don't have to worry about a history here. It's all in one place at one time. There's our new Constitution, and you don't have to go back anymore. You don't have to know the history anymore. You don't have to know, right, all of the statutory changes that were piecemeal here and there. We're going to make one big change, right, on the Constitution, then one big change on all the statutes They're all going to be lined up. It's all going to make sense. It's going to be cohesive, right? That'll be great. It's an awful lot of work, but you do it all at one time and you clean everything up. So there's some good arguments as far down the road as we are with our current Constitution. There's a couple of good arguments there for us to sit down and write a new Constitution, just start over, right? That could be interesting, right? So that's the good out of a comprehensive change to the Constitution. The bad part about a comprehensive change, it's hard. It's hard to do, right? We got to get super majorities, right? You don't change the Constitution with a 50% plus one vote. You change constitutions with 2/3 votes and 3/4 votes, things like that. So you've got to get a lot of people on the same page at the same time, thinking the same thing, right? To make a full constitutional change, right? And that's going to be hard, right? The opportunities to get all of us together at one place at one time and make an impact they're there, but they're not easy, right? They're not easy at all. And you throw in people like Texans, right, who can be hard-headed about things and have a perspective of this is the way it ought to be done, and then you have the people that are going to just be obstinate, right? They're hard-headed Texans like, no, we don't want to change, right? What we got's working. Why do we want to sit down and do all this? No, just keep doing what we're doing. We've got a political term for them. We call them cockroaches. I don't know exactly where all of that comes from, but it's the term used to refer to people that are going to stop a constitutional change process just because they don't want change, not because it might not be a good one, right? I don't know how that relates into calling someone necessarily a cockroach, but that is the term used to refer to obstructionists for constitutional change. Maybe because they just sit off to the side in the dark and they only come out when they want to say, no, don't make a change. I don't know. Anyway, they would rather argue. Well, I mean, there are some of us that enjoy arguing, Ruben. There's no doubt about it. The opposite of a cockroach is a revisionist, right? And that's somebody that loves change. Might be a progressive, maybe, right? Somebody wants to change things, and they're all for revising the whole document. And again, there's some good reasons to do it, but they're going to want to ignore how difficult this part is and say, just get on board. This is a good thing. Let's do it, right? Let's go. And sometimes being so positive to bring change because you think change brings good is not true, right? We have to be careful sometimes. When we change things, we need to make sure we're changing them for a good reason and that we change only what we need to fix, right? I mean, throwing the baby out with the bathwater is a little too much, right? We just need to change the bathwater. So you got to be careful of cockroaches. You got to be careful of revisionists. Both of them are going to have impacts on the political process if we try to come up with a new constitution. And we've tried several times since 1876 to come up with a whole new constitution. And politically, we weren't able to get everybody in the same place at the same time to let this happen. So it's hard to do. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of agreement. And frankly, we just can't get it done right now. Yeah, as long as you're not one, right? I wouldn't want to be called a cockroach, but it's not a word you'll forget pretty easily, right? And there's that again. All right, so let's close down this chapter. Is there anything about constitutions that you want to ask me about? I'm going to start loading up our next chapter, right, where we're going to start talking about federalism. I say that it's being a little slow right now. There we go. Is there any questions on constitutionalism and constitutions in general? Thank you. That's good. And that's the point, right? I mean, you're reading the material, and the book, again, the book that we're using is one that was put together to be free. So it doesn't quite go into quite as much depth as say a commercial book on that. Yeah, and I don't know, Theodora, why they called them units. So the book calls them units, so I called them units, but they're chapters, right? They're chapters. Would I like to see a comprehensive constitution? That's a hard question for me to answer. Yes, I think I would, and I think I would because I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to understand our government and our institutions better if we were to rewrite our Constitution so that it made sense to us. I think there's something to be gained from getting it into a language and a cadence and using words that we are comfortable with today. I also think it would be good, I would agree, of kind of relegating the Constitution we have to history and getting a Constitution that is ours, that speaks directly to the government as we work today, and not have to keep up with changing the Constitution, right? Right now, it's fairly common for us to see anywhere from 6 to 8 or 10 constitutional propositions every couple of years on our ballots, which means all of us as citizens that are going to vote on it, if we're going to do our job right, have to think constitutionally about what these provisions are doing. I think it gives a lot of opportunity for political elitists and interest groups to change our Constitution and change the nature of it, because most of us are not political scientists and are not lawyers and don't understand the depth of a constitutional change. And that a constitutional change might change a lot of statutory law behind it. So I think in that sense, it would be better if we did less amendments, and therefore we would need an up-to-date, modern, comprehensive constitution in place for that to be the case. As far as a constitution that would change the distribution of powers or the political players in the system, I don't know that I would be on board with that necessarily. I think Texas is a pretty good division of political powers between the legislature and the executive branch and the judicial branch. And so I don't know that I'd want to see any of the basic design of government change with the Constitution, but I would like to see what we have get encapsulated in something more modern, more understandable, and more compact. Oh, a lot of people feel that way, Robert. A lot of people feel that way. I don't think that's possible. And the reason I say that is because while it's certainly possible that we could limit the amount of money that comes in through political action committees or comes through interest groups, I think you're going to be able to actually change the influence of corporate executives, right, extending their power and talking and having an impact on representatives in government. I think certainly, right, we could limit the money, right? We could actually limit the dollars, but I'm not sure that we would actually change the influence as much, right? So that's the part that I think is a little more problematic. If politicians are making their decisions just for the money, then getting the money out of it might certainly have an impact. And Citizens United would be the federal case that we would look at for that, because as you mentioned, Elijah, right, that was the Supreme Court case at the federal level that said money equals free speech, and corporations have a right to express themselves just like people do. I think there's some real concerns with that ought to be addressed. On the other end of it, though, if I'm an individual and I have a lot of money, why should other people be able to tell me how I spend my money to get information out, communication out about what I think is important? Right, and that's the side of it. Right, that's the side of it that the federal courts recognize, right, of money equaling free speech, right? If you limit my ability to spend money on politics, you limit my voice. Now, that doesn't mean we have to say the doors are wide open for me to donate money to politicians, right? So there's an argument there, right? So, and it's an interesting argument that we need to think about, right? So let me catch up with you here. Didn't Trump try and make it easier for government employees to be removed, and Biden reversed it? Yes, there are civil service protections in place for civilian employees in the government that protect their jobs. It tried to protect their jobs from the vagaries of politics. In other words, the idea behind a civil service and behind bureaucrats is that you hire people the same way you would hire people for a business. You interview them based on their merit, based on their experience, and you hire the best people to do the job, regardless of their political affiliation. And then you try to, through civil service rules, tell them you can't do any politics in this civil service job. Your job is to follow the rules and to implement them the way they're written. The politics will be handled by the politicians. There's a lot of arguments being made that civil servants don't work that way, and that they're insulated, and they bring their politics to jobs, and they use their personal politics to make decisions, and then can't be fired. And that's just not quite true. I spent 24 years as a civil servant in Texas, working for a couple state agencies. And the way that it works is you get hired. You know, I was in a position where I was hiring people to work for me all of the time. And my job interviews were exactly like job interviews that I've given and taken on the outside in the commercial world, right? I was interviewing people. Here's what the job is. Here are the tasks of the job. Here's the requirements that you need, the merits that you need to have to be able to do this job. I'm going to interview you on, can you do that, right? Do you have the computer skills? Do you have the writing skills? Do you have whatever the skill is the job took, right? We interviewed people that way. And we had forms, tools that we would use to evaluate them and score them. And the person that got the best score is the one that we might make an offer to, unless they were just like the worst human being possible, right? I mean, you gotta count that too, right? Are they going to fit in with my people? And so, the last half of my my bureaucratic career in politics was in a position of management and hiring people. And so I hired civil servants, as Lauren puts out there, not politicians. And then I, as a bureaucrat, was held to civil service requirements, not political requirements. And when I was called downtown to go speak in front of the legislature, to speak to the politicians, if what I said was political, not practical, I was in trouble, right? My job was not to espouse a political position. My job was to say, here's what the statute says, Here's what the administrative rule about that statute says. Here's how we're doing it. If you make this change, here's how that change will impact us. Not, is it a good change? Is it a bad change? I like it or I don't like it. Just the brass tacks. Here's how it's supposed to, here's how I see it working. Y'all make the decision. Whichever decision you make, that's what we'll do. That's how it's supposed to work. If you don't believe it's working that way, right? If you don't believe that bureaucrats are doing their job that way, you do what Trump did, right? If you believe there's a deep state, right, that is going to do what it wants to do regardless of what politicians are passing in statute, then you fire all the civil servants and you put political appointees in there to do what you want them to do. I'm not here to tell you, right, one is true and one's not true, but that's the debate, right? That's the argument. Are civil servants implementing the law? If they are, then the civil service system makes sense and it's a good thing. If they're implementing their politics, that's a bad thing, right? Especially if the politicians that have been elected are telling them to do something different through statute. I'll tell you what I think is more the case of how these perspectives happen. And I saw this personally here in Texas, right? So we have rules based on other statutes that tell bureaucrats how to do their job, okay, that we have to follow. If we don't follow those, we're breaking the law. So a new change comes from the politicians. A statute gets passed and it says, do this now, right? You used to test people on issue X, now test them on issue Y. Okay, that's the law. That's what changed. I got to now change, say, a licensing exam to test on Y, not X. Not a big deal. However, I've got other statutes that say anytime I'm going to make a change like that, I have to basically start a 6 to 8 month process of publicly making everyone aware this change is coming and inviting, right, the public in to, right, the agency to have a say about it. Now, it's still the law. It has to happen, but we might get a lot of information about how to do it, right, that'll be different than if we didn't have that information. If I don't use that process, and I just implement the law right straight away without going through this public hearing process, that's illegal. So a lot of people on the outside see this public hearing process and go, wait a minute, they've already been told to do X or do Y, and now they're doing all this. Seems like they're bringing their politics into it, right? Because they're inviting all of this other stuff, and they're not moving as fast as they should. Well, the bureaucrats stuck, right? They've got a law telling them what to do and a law telling them how to do it. They got to do both. That process, I think, for a lot of people has been deemed, right, the deep state. In other words, the bureaucrats stalling or pushing back or not doing what the politicians have told them to do. And if that's the case, if I'm right about that, that's not a deep state. That's the way the process is supposed to work. And it's supposed to be slow and deliberative and open to public comment, hence democratic. That's ineffective. Or no, I'm not sorry, it's not ineffective. It's inefficient, right? It's designed to be inefficient. And if you're a politician, or you're a businessman that's become elected president where you're used to being able to say, do this now, and it starts happening right away, you think you're being, right, played a bit, and you may not be, right? So if that's the case, that's not deep state, that's democracy, and it's slow, deliberative action. That's not to say that bureaucrats can't be political, and they're wrong if they are, and maybe try to do what they want regardless of what the law says that's been passed. And if they're doing that, they're wrong and they should be fired. And under the civil service laws, they can be fired for that. They get a hearing just like most employees do, right? Where an HR would do a hearing. Well, here you would have the same thing on the political side. So they get a hearing to say, hey, no, I wasn't doing what I wanted. I was doing this, right? And I was supposed to. And then someone will say yes or no, and they'll get fired or they won't get fired. And in Texas, we do that, right? In the federal level, they do that, right? I've fired people, right? I've fired them because they didn't do their job right. I've fired them because they didn't follow the law. I've fired them because they weren't good at what they were doing, right? All of those options are there in the civil service and in the bureaucracy. It's just you got to follow the processes to do it. So, right, yes, Trump tried to make it easier to get government employees removed. I don't know that Biden has reversed it. I'm sure that he probably will, given where he comes from. Politically speaking, he'll probably go back to the civil service model that we have in place, which is intended to keep politics out of the application of law process and try to make sure politics happens at the legislative and executive level where it's supposed to happen. Let's see, I'm looking down here. Robert says Trump also revoked the rule for bringing White House staff from lobbying right before leaving. Yeah, I don't have to say anything about that. That's true. And it shouldn't be hard for you to divine what the case is there and where we're going with it. I'm sure that will also change. See, that's the thing, and I know this isn't Texas politics, but what did that mean? What that meant was civil servants, right, and political appointees are not supposed to be working for themselves while they're in public office. And there's rules there that prevent that say, if you're lobbying for an outside interest, you can't be an appointee, right? You've got to work for the government, not work for the government and help some of your cronies that are in business. And so there was provisions in place that said you can't, right, help one business get in touch with another business, right? You can't be the go-between while you're in government to help your friends make money. You can't lobby for an outside interest while you're in government. And Trump pulled that revision down within the abilities that he could to allow his friends, right, and himself and his family to steer governmental contracts, to steer business toward things that were going to make either them or their friends money down the road. And that's not supposed to happen if we're keeping bureaucrats and political appointees focused on government work and not on private profit. And so you should be impeached from office, removed from office, if you are using your governmental office to help yourself or to help your friends. That's not the point. Of course, right, there are different perspectives on that. And so Trump didn't see that there was anything necessarily wrong with that, and he wanted to allow that to happen. I'm sure Biden, being a Democrat and being someone that thinks government should be regulating a lot of these independent actions, will put regulations back in place on that. This stems from presidents using executive orders, right? It's a little bit transfers over to governors as well, right? Executive offices. What we're seeing right now with all of these executive orders from Biden is that he's nullifying executive orders from Trump. And that's the thing, is that the power of an executive order, if it's a good executive order, it still only has power while the president that wrote it is in office. And so every time we change presidents, especially if those presidents change between political parties, a whole bunch of executive orders are getting changed, right? There's one executive order that's been changed like 4 or 5 times between different presidents is the federal government being able to talk about abortions and abortion processes and the legality of that as a process. When Democrats are in office, federal employees can talk about it and outside the country, and they can talk about it between the states and inside the country. When Republicans have been in place, they put a gag on that and say you can't talk about it, right? Because, right, they disagree and on that politically, and that's always a plank on both political parties' side about what they're wanting to do. So that executive order flip-flops with every change of president that has from a different party, right? So Reagan put it there, right? Bush kept it. Clinton came in, he overrode it with a new executive order. He went out, Bush Jr. came in, he put it back in, right? Bush went out, Obama came in, he put Clinton's back in, right? Trump came in, he took out Obama's and put in, and now Biden can do, if he hasn't, he will do the same thing, right? That's the temperature of executive orders, is they may not exist, they may not last past that administration. All right, good discussion. Not, a little off topic, but not too bad, right? I mean, it's giving you hopefully some insight into some of the politics that goes around government, how government works, and that's true both at the federal and the state level. Right, we have lots of money here in Texas. We have lots of interest groups here in Texas. We'll talk about them later, and so we'll get into this again. Yeah, I hope it helps. I'm trying to make sure that, and I probably didn't say this, my goal as an instructor is to explain how these things work and why they're working the way they are. If I do my job the way I think I ought to, you won't know my political leanings. It's not my job to tell you that Republicans are right or Democrats are right or Libertarians are right. My job is to explain to you how all that comes together. So at the end of the semester, if you ask me personally what my political beliefs are, I'll be happy to share them with you. But if I do my job right, you should still be guessing. Right? And you can, Davey, you can. I've taken the political compass too, right? So, and so I know where I land, and I know where I'm thinking, but it's not my job to make you think politically the way I think. My job is to give you the tools to think politically, right? And to engage the system and to figure out how you want it to work for you. So my job is to turn out people that will be interested enough to maybe engage with the political parties and the policies. It's not my job to try to get you to engage with one of them. I want you to all vote. I want you to all pay attention, right? I want you to be involved in the process. So, okay, I've got 5 minutes left, and I'm going to just say we'll start federalism next week. And I'll take any questions you have for the last 5 minutes of class, and we'll call it a day as far as new material goes. No sense in starting a new topic. So anything else about constitutions and how changes are important, or where we were going with our discussion, I'll be happy to entertain that for a few more minutes. And if you don't want to sit around and ask a question or listen to an answer, feel free to head out. Other than quizzes on the 11th, is anything due? You've got your political compass due tomorrow. So if you haven't done your political compass, get that done, right, for extra credit. The quizzes are never actually required, right? They're extra credit too. So, but they turn off before the exam, right? So you won't be able to finish those quizzes for extra credit once the exam comes live, right? So they'll run out on the 11th, and then we'll have our test, right? And that's it right now, right? Do your compass, do your quizzes. You should be starting to look at the paper topics and think about what you want to write about from those topics. right, and maybe get started on that. So, because they're due in the middle of April. So, I know that's 6 to 7 weeks away, but it's coming, right? No, it's more than that. This is beginning of February, but yeah. Do the quizzes look like the test? Yes, they do. They're all multiple choice. They're over the same topics that you're going to see on the test. The whole intent behind the quiz is to give you questions that will get you ready for the test, right? So the idea here is I don't give you a study guide, I give you a quiz guide, right? And I let you take them as many times as you want so you can practice, right? So you get the right answers. You only get extra credit on the first, right? You only get points, extra credit points the first time you take it, but you can take it a second, third, or fourth time, right? To get the right answer and to make sure you're starting to remember it like a flashcard session, right? So take advantage of that, yeah. And they're going to go by fast, right? So don't be surprised. You start that quiz. If you have 20 questions on that quiz, you might have 10 minutes, right? Yeah, if you get it wrong, it will show you the answer, right? If you get it right, it doesn't. I don't think it shows you the answer for the right ones, right? It only focuses on the wrong ones. And if I'm wrong about that, somebody holler at me and I'll take another look at it. But I'm pretty sure that's the way I set it up. No, you're welcome. Anything else? I'll try to keep it interesting. Right? See y'all on Tuesday.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good weekend, folks.